This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify my television, televise them telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and this is Palestine Declassified, where we highlight the international struggle to liberate Palestine and expose Israel's relentless efforts to manipulate the political class and control the corporate media. In today's show, we'll be looking at the life and legacy of Iran's martyred leader, Grand Ayatollah Ali Jamenei, who was assassinated by a US Zionist strike on his household on the 28th of February this year. His funeral now marks a momentous period in history, with millions attending from across Iran and all around the world. In addition to playing a vital role in the triumph of Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979, Ayatollah Jamenei served Iran as its wartime president in the 1980s during the first imposed war led by Saddam Hussein. He later served as the leader of Iran's revolution for 37 years. Under his leadership, Iran rebuilt and expanded its infrastructure as well as its defences, and made numerous social, technological and scientific advancements. Ayatollah Khamenei's dedication to the liberation of Palestine, and indeed the liberation of West Asia in its entirety from the scourge of Zionism, not only led to his assassination, but also to the targeting of Iran with economic and military warfare. The Islamic Republic that he helped to build continues to be sovereign, independent, and a beacon to resistance movements worldwide. So joining me to discuss Ayatollah Khamenei's life is the host of the Attrition podcast, Ammar Kazmi, who's also a political and legal commentator. And I'm also joined by our resident expert, David Miller, who's the UK's leading scholarly critic of Israel. He's also a co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch and a senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zayem University. Welcome to the show. Ammar, give us a brief overview, will you, of Ayatollah Khamenei's political life and how he came to be so dedicated to the freedom of Palestine.
Well, Ayatollah Jamenei was born in 1939 during a period of intense political upheaval, both in Iran and across the world. Of course, in that same year, the Second World War began, and Iran found itself in a strategically vital position. At that time, Iran's ruler, Reza Shah Pahlavi, was aligned with Nazi Germany, and he had actually refused to cooperate with the Allied powers. And in response, the Allies forced him to abdicate so that they could secure supply routes through Iran to the Soviet Union to support its war effort, which became known as the Persian Corridor. And his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was then installed as the new Shah. And that really deepened Western influence in Iran, which had already been building for roughly a century before that. And it was against that backdrop of foreign interference and growing resentment about Western meddling in Iran that anti-imperialist Islamic movements like Fada'iyan Islam rose up. And so Ayatollah Khamenei was born into this highly charged political atmosphere, and he became politicized from a very young age. And when he was just 13 years old, he attended a lecture by Nawab Safavi, the leader of Fada'iyan Islam, and that left a lasting impression on him. In that lecture, Nawab Safavi was denouncing Western influence in Iran. And during Ayatollah Khamenei's clerical studies in the holy city of Qom, which is just south of Tehran, he became introduced to the great revolutionary Imam Khomeini. And of course, he was profoundly shaped by his thinking as well. And as we know, Imam Khomeini was a fierce opponent of Zionism and he was committed to the eventual end of the Zionist entity in West Asia. In fact, after the triumph of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, was the first foreign official to visit Iran. And Imam Khomeini also instituted Al-Quds Day, which is an annual protest for occupied Jerusalem that takes place on the last Friday of the holy month of Ramadan. So in essence, Ayatollah Jamenei was inculcated in an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-Zionist worldview from a very young age, with his major influences being people like Nawab Safavi, Imam Khomeini, and even some revolutionary Sunni Muslim thinkers. And he took forward these political influences with him during his time as president of Iran, and later, of course, as the leader of Iran's Islamic Revolution, where his dedication to the cause of Palestine remained a defining feature of his leadership. And just to say a bit more about his political life, Ayatollah Khamenei was a revolutionary. During the time of the Shah, he was part of Imam Khomeini's movement, and he was imprisoned several times, and he was subject to constant harassment by the Shah's secret police called the Savak. And after the revolution, he helped to establish the Islamic Republican Party alongside others like Ayatollah Beheshti, which secured revolutionary Iran as an Islamic republic. And as wartime president, he visited the front lines to boost soldiers' morale in Iran's sacred defense against Saddam Hussein's invasion in the 1980s. And indeed, he endured his own share of sacrifices. He was the subject of an assassination attempt by the terrorist group MEK, which planted a bomb in a tape recorder on a podium from which he was delivering a Friday sermon. That paralyzed his right arm for the rest of his life. And later, when he became the Wali al-Faqih, the guardian jurist, he took on that role with great humility, even though he didn't consider himself to be qualified, and he didn't want to actually have that position. He lived up to his immense responsibilities that were placed upon him, and in that role he oversaw the reconstruction of Iran after the war. He rebuilt and expanded the country's defenses. He helped to pioneer a number of social and scientific breakthroughs. He helped to create an axis of resistance across West Asia to challenge the US Zionist empire. This is a man with an incredibly rich political legacy, but truly I think he'll be remembered most of all for living and dying for the Palestinian cause.
David, what material ways did Ayatollah Khamenei aid resistance movements in Palestine?
Well, it's well established, isn't it, that the axis of resistance was the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and in particular was led on by Ayatollah Jamenei. And of course that meant diplomatic support for the Palestinians, but also it meant direct military support for the Palestinians. Without the support of Jamenei and indeed others in the Iranian government, there wouldn't have been the kind of resistance that we've seen from the Palestinian factions. And of course, it wasn't just the question of the Islamic resistance, which the Iranians supported. They supported Hamas, they also supported Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but they also gave resources in an unlimited way to the secular Marxist organizations, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It didn't matter. As long as they were resisting the Zionist entity, that was enough for Jamenei. And that, of course, was the correct position. It was a position which was not sectarian, which was not politically restrictive, and which, of course, meant that a Shia government were supporting Sunni revolutionaries, something which for many people is unthinkable. And of course, that's been the case all the way through this process, through the whole of the axis of resistance. The question of whether you're Sunni or Shia is of no consequence whatsoever. I remember being in Iran, in Mashhad, where Ayatollah Jamenei lived with his family before he joined the revolution in 1979, just before the revolution happened. And he had a very humble and austere home. But in there, when I went to see that, and there's a sort of museum there, you saw the way in which he had involved himself in revolutionary politics from very, very early in his life. He was, of course, internally exiled by the Shah, and he was very interested in developing deep knowledge on questions of Islamic and other forms of resistance. And he, of course, read very deeply into the work, for example, of Sayyid Qutb, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, although, of course, he took a somewhat different political stance on Qutb's writings sometime later. So Jamenei has been not just a practical leader, but also a very important intellectual and ideological leader. And I think people should remember that.
Well, Ammar, just tell us what role that Ayatollah Jamenei played in developing Iran's ballistic missile program.
Yeah, Ayatollah Jamenei played a central and long-standing role in the development of Iran's ballistic missile program, which began during the first imposed war on Iran by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. At that time, Ayatollah Jamenei was Iran's president, a wartime president, and it was a brutal war with Saddam Hussein repeatedly using missiles and aircraft to strike Iranian cities. And at the time, this was a critical vulnerability that Iran had, because it couldn't effectively retaliate and deter those attacks. And so there was a need to create that deterrent. And thankfully, Iran managed to acquire some Scud missiles from abroad, principally from the DPRK and Libya. But those were, very few in number, and they were limited to a range of around 300 kilometers. And Iranian engineers had to then think about reverse engineering those missiles. Why? To be able to produce more of them, and of course to not be dependent on other countries. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei took a keen personal interest in developing that missile program because he rightly understood that these missiles were absolutely essential for Iran's national survival and self-determination. Now, a key figure here, which has to be mentioned, is Hassan Tehrani Muqaddam, who is known as the father of Iran's ballistic missile program. And since the 1980s, he worked to develop better and more improved and more sophisticated missiles that could have a range of 2,000 kilometers, and even beyond that, reaching as far as the Zionist entity and further than that too. Now, Ayatollah Khamenei didn't just support those efforts by Muqaddam and others, he was personally involved in expanding the IRGC's aerospace force. And we saw ever greater arsenals of missiles being developed with the Shahab series, the Sajil, and the Fatah series, and so on. And today, we now have the Khorramshahr missile and other really powerful hypersonic missiles, which we saw deployed to great effect during the past few months. And that really struck terror into the heart of the Zionist enemy. They were unable to defend themselves against these incredibly fast, sophisticated Iranian ballistic missiles, which, if you think about it, got through so many layers of defenses. It's not just the US THAAD missiles and David Sling and these other US and Zionist air defense systems. It's also the air defense systems of Jordan and other countries that these missiles fly over. They got through all of those defenses and hit targets in the Zionist entity precisely and effectively. And, it was Ayatollah Khamenei who emphasized the need to create more powerful, more accurate, more mobile ballistic missiles that were indigenously produced within Iran, giving Iran self-sufficiency and a powerful deterrent against the enemy. And that self-sufficiency is what gives Iran the edge. It's all fine and well for these Arab dictators and monarchies to have lots of expensive US and British equipment, but in wartime, you need to be able to operate and replenish that equipment. They can't do that. They are totally dependent on the US and others to manage their defenses for them. And we saw over the past few months that the US was either incapable of doing that, or they didn't want to do that because they were prioritizing the defense of the Zionist entity. So the importance of having an indigenous, self-sufficient ballistic missile program is really important. And of course, Ayatollah Khamenei consistently defended the missile program against both external and internal pressures. He did not allow the missile program to be put on the negotiating table with the Americans during the JCPOA nuclear talks. and his son Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei did not allow it to be placed on the negotiating table with the Americans this time around either. And why is that? It's because this missile program is the cornerstone of Iran's asymmetric defense strategy, and it's allowed Iran to project power, to support its allies, and also to defend itself. And the reason for that, alongside the many engineers and others like Hassan Tehrani Muqaddam, is the martyr Ayatollah Khamenei, who supported, extended, and defended Iran's ballistic missile program.
Well, David, what do you think motivated the United States and the Zionists to take the step of assassinating Ayatollah Khamenei?
Well, the Zionists have had this idea that that's how you defeat your adversary, that you have a decapitation strategy. You assassinate the leader, the senior military and other advisors. They, of course, have had a strategy of assassinating nuclear scientists in Iran. And let's, of course, remember the pager strikes, the pager attacks, and then the assassination of a leading cadre of both the IRGC and of Hezbollah's leadership in recent times. On Jamenei in particular, they have this idea that if you remove the leader and perhaps that the upper echelon of military control and power, that you will leave the system rudderless, unable to function, that it will likely collapse, and then you can bring in your other resources, such as, for example, Kurdish terrorists from the north to assassinate and to try and destabilize the country, which, of course, is what we saw in January this year, where they deployed such assets. And they believe that that is the way in which they can actually destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also to help to put in position those in the leadership who they would prefer to be leaders over more principalist or revolutionary leaders like Jamenei and indeed others. But of course, that's a mistake. And we've seen that's a mistake because what they didn't understand and what they haven't understood is, both in the case of Hezbollah and in the case of Iran, is that these organizations took measures to make sure that should there be a decapitation strike, there would be a way of replacing the operational security. And that meant, of course, devolving, with the IRGC, for example, devolving power down to lower level commanders. And that, of course, totally evaded the possibility of the collapse of the government. And the same was the case also in relation to Hezbollah, which, of course, many people thought had been collapsed and destroyed. And now we see them fighting fit and taking on the occupation forces in southern Lebanon. So it's an attempt to try and manage and manipulate, like they thought they could do in relation to Venezuela, where they removed Maduro, and they then wanted to have a compliant leader who might come in to work with them. But of course, that's not going to work in relation to Iran. And indeed, what happened in relation to Iran was that the Americans even killed some of the people who they would have liked to have become part of the leadership in Khamenei's place. So it's a strategy which is born out of a misunderstanding about the revolution and the nature of revolutionary ideology, and indeed the inventiveness in response to their strategies, which has been shown by the Islamic Republic of Iran under Jamenei.
Well, Ammar, I mean, what do you say to those Muslims who make accusations of sectarianism against Iran and actually the Ayatollah Khamenei himself?
Those people who level accusations of sectarianism against the Islamic Republic of Iran and against Ayatollah Khamenei are either deeply ignorant or they are malicious and they are serving the enemies of Islam. Ayatollah Khamenei repeatedly called for the unity of the entire Islamic community across the world, both Sunni and Shia, and he implored them to join hands to fight against the real enemies of Islam, which are US imperialism, Zionism, and the takfiri ideologies that they sponsor. Iran has been the primary backer of the Palestinian resistance for decades. The last time I checked, Palestine is a Sunni Muslim country. Right? The Palestinian resistance is overwhelmingly Sunni. Iran has held unity conferences with Sunni Muslims, fostered ties with Sunni Muslim institutions, And Ayatollah Jamenei even famously instructed Shia Muslims to not insult or curse historic personalities that are revered by Sunni Muslims. So just to explain that a little bit for those who are unfamiliar, one of the major differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims is their view of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family. Now, Sunnis tend to revere all of the companions of the Prophet, but Shia tend to take a more critical view of the companions. And there are Shia Muslims who publicly curse and disrespect some of the companions that are revered by Sunni Muslims. And that's a great source of tension. It's a great source of conflict, and it even results in killings in the Muslim world. You know, this is a hugely contentious issue. And Ayatollah Khamenei made clear that Shia Muslims have a duty to respect Sunni Muslims, to not cause them offense, and to not engage in this sort of behavior. And really, it comes down to the question of who the enemy is. Is the enemy of Sunni and Shia Muslims each other? Should we consider each other to be our enemies? No, we shouldn't. Imam Khomeini famously said, we are busy arguing about whether to fold our hands in prayer or not, because Sunni Muslims cross their hands in prayer and Shia Muslims keep them to their side. Meanwhile, the enemy is plotting to cut our arms off. So the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and its worldview does not permit sectarianism, and Ayatollah Khamenei was deeply opposed to any kind of intra-Islamic sectarianism. And I would argue that those who are truly sectarian are those who seek to fracture the global Islamic community in order to protect the thrones of the Arab dictators and their alliances with Zionism. But the Islamic Republic of Iran has chosen a different path, and that is the path of unity and steadfast resistance, not sectarianism.
Well, David, as you know, millions are attending Ayatollah Khamenei's funeral. What does that say, do you think, about the mainstream media narrative about him in the West?
Well, the mainstream media narrative is, of course, hopelessly adrift from reality, hopelessly naive, and hopelessly enthralled to propaganda from the state, British state, the American state, but also, of course, from Zionist influences, as we know from our previous shows. But look, the way in which the Iranian people relate to their leadership is quite different to the way in which we in the UK or in the US relate to presidents. And, it's not just a question of Sir Keir Starmer or Donald Trump having very low approval ratings, and they're particularly low, but it's also, there's a completely different set of relationships. Look, I think that the funeral is a truly extraordinary event. We've seen a lot of extraordinary funerals in Iran in recent years. In particular, of course, the funeral of Hajj Qasem Soleimani, which was just truly enormous. And it looks like this funeral is bigger than that, as you would probably expect. And of course, the events in Tehran, with the streets and the squares thronged with people, and indeed in Mashhad, where he will be laid to rest, are really very, very extraordinary. Nothing like that happens in the UK. Yes, of course, when Queen Elizabeth died, there was a big funeral, but nothing like the kind of events that you see in Tehran, and indeed in other cities in Iran as well. And of course, that it reflects the pattern of mass demonstrations across the whole of the country in the last 70, 80, 90 days since the supposed ceasefire, where the people have been out demonstrating in favour of the Islamic Republic of Iran and the government, and indeed especially of the IRGC, chanting about what the head of the IRGC's aerospace division should do in relation to Tel Aviv. So that kind of relationship that there is between the people and the leadership is quite different to what you have in the UK, the US, France, and Germany. And people don't understand that if they watch the Western media. But of course, if they have access to social media, and many millions do, they are beginning to see something of the way in which Iran functions, which completely evades the ideological blinkers of Western media.
Yes, the affection is really in sharp contrast to anything you see in the West, and interesting to see how the corporate media actually report on the funeral. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So I'd like to thank our guest, Amar Kazmi, and of course our resident expert, David Miller. If you want to support the show, you can follow us on X, Facebook, Rumble, and Telegram, where we post regular clips and updates. And if you want to see us continue standing up for Palestine and exposing the Zionist colony, please consider donating to our fighting fund. In the meantime, make a date to join us again next week when I'll be back alongside David Miller with more exclusive content that you won't find in the corporate media. So until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.